and welcome to another episode of the Best Book Club. I'm your host, Nu Fatora, and this is the podcast where I discuss the best stories with the best minds in the community. On this episode, I'll be discussing Waistband Variance during Atomic Wedgies, a study by EnigmaticSystematic. With me, I have the writer of this very creative story. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Absolutely. I'm very excited to discuss this story. It grabbed me, and I did not even realize at the time that you were the one who wrote it.
Yeah. Yeah, no,
So,
this one kind of. Oh, sorry.
go right ahead.
I was gonna say this one kind of caught me by surprise. This wasn't. This was something that I had like very loosely conceptualized a long time before I ever wrote it, and it wasn't anything that I thought could be put down into like a proper story. So it was just kind of one of those ideas that I was just satisfied to leave as an idea. And then I kind of just started fooling around with it one day and started writing a little bit. And I think I finished it in like one sitting. It was like 4 or 5 hours of writing and editing and stuff like that. But it just like completely caught me by surprise because I just was like, wow, I am having zero trouble writing this, which was super fun. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, that's actually that's pretty interesting to me. That I have a very similar process in my writing overall, as I sit down and write the entire part of a story or the entire story, depending on if it's a one-off or part of a longer running story, just all in one session. Um,
Hmm.
so why do you think that it was? Why do you think that it was so easy to capture that idea? What was the shift in your mind? Was there any shift in your mind, or was like what led you to be able to put it all down at once? Is there any quantifiable factors in
Well,
that?
I had a lot of time on my hands. I actually wrote this. This story was a series of like 3 or 4 stories I wrote in like a 2 week span. I was going on vacation at the time actually, and my sibling and their spouse and I were all driving out to um, North Carolina to meet some family that had flown out there, and we were going to spend a couple weeks out there. And so everybody flew, but we were the youngest ones, and our broke, and so we drove. And there was one day that we decided to just like leg the entire, like a good majority of the trip. Like I think we drove for like 18 hours straight or 20 hours straight.
Wow.
And so I just had nothing to do because I was sitting in the back of the car and had like 20 hours of drive time ahead of me. And so that's whenever I kind of was like, let's toy around with some of this stuff that I've had, bottled up in my head for a while and see what happens with it. And once I did that, like I said, it just kind of came naturally to me. I think I was just in the zone. I listening to music. Everybody was quiet because we're all cranky being in the car
Yeah.
that long, and so um, I had nothing to better to think of or do at the time. And so I think it was just like weirdly enough, despite the circumstances, like the perfect setting. No distractions, nothing else to do. Um, and so, yeah, I think once I really got in the headspace, and like I said, it was an idea I'd had for quite some time. And so I had thought little bits here and there about if I were to write it, what would it look like? And so all of that kind of just congealed into this perfect storm that let me just like hammer this thing out in like 5 or 6 hours or however long it took,
Mhm.
which is cool, which is really,
Yeah.
really cool.
That's kind of a funny word to use for it, congealed, but I think
Yeah.
it's a great word to describe it. And I mean, I don't think that's even weird for that to happen that way because I
Hmm.
mean, when you think about it, this fetish is sort of a very private thing, um,
Hmm.
and so the members of the community sort of tend to uh, draw into themselves when it comes to this fetish, and
Right.
so developing an idea, if it's any other kind of idea for just a regular story, um, you might tend to be open and sharing it with other people, but
Right.
because it pertains to this fetish, but pertains to something so personal about ourselves, um, I completely understand why that sort of setting would be so conducive to you developing that idea so fully.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I totally agree.
So, to give a little bit of background on this story, as of this recording, going through your catalog of work, it's your most popular one at 22,000 views and one of your 23 favorites. First of all, just congratulations on that success. And
Thank you.
you have a very similar level of success with your other stories. So, just a round of applause for that.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Where would you rank it in your growing catalog?
In terms of favorites, definitely in my top three, I think. At the time that I wrote it, it was my favorite, and I think that was just kind of, you know, the the high of the completely unexpected success that this ended up having, which I was like completely caught off guard by and very very grateful for. Um, I know my particular writings are very specific, and not as cookie cutter, which isn't a bad thing at all. But I have always been of the opinion that I want to write what I want to see written. And so I take very particular or specific ideas, and kind of adapt them to the fetish and expand upon them there. So sometimes it's something that I'm like really proud of, and like no one cares, like because it's something so niche and so specific that people just don't have an interest in it, and that's totally fine because I'm happy with it. But um, everything leading up to it, the kind of the realization of seeing an idea that I've had for so long finished, posted and doing well, it was super awesome, and I absolutely loved it. And so it definitely was my favorite at the time that I'd written it, and for quite a while after. But now I'd say it's comfortably like number three or number two. So
Okay. And so, what would you also rank in your top three? What are the other two top stories that you would recommend as the first readings for readers new to your work?
Weirdly enough, my favorite is actually the most recent one that I've written, which is called hold on, pull it up here. It's called Nerds Have Standards Too. This was also a very similar story where I had this idea and just kind of threw the idea out off the cuff, actually to somebody else in the community that I have become pretty good friends with, I would say, which is super cool. And it started out mostly as a joke, and then he kind of made another joke based off of it, and I was kind of like, that's actually not a bad idea. And so I ended up writing that one, which is my favorite. I'm a really big fan of how that one turned out. And then a couple of the other ones that I really like that I reference fairly frequently. On the ethics of wedgies, that was a really fun one for me. I'm a big casual fan of philosophy. I'm not like trained or anything, but I really love learning about it, and so that was a really fun one to combine a couple of my other interests that have like nothing to do with the fetish and apply it to it. Kind of looking at like the fetish and wedgies in general through different sort of moral or ethical lenses was super super fun. Um, and then trying to remember um, the series that I did, the one about the Twitch streamer. Who I think it's just twitch.tv/ wedgie. That's what it's called. That
Mhm.
one was really really fun. I just that's just the kind of dumb fun that I really enjoy writing. There's nothing deeper to it, nothing deeper or more intense going on. It's not a dive into my psychology or anything. It's just a fun one, so I like that one a lot.
Well, yeah, don't push me because I'm sure I can
Yeah.
find some kind of deeper meaning to it.
I'm sure there's some Freudian mistakes I made and have revealed something about myself in all of my writings, but I don't care to look too much. So,
Okay. Um, and when you say that the idea for this story was very specific,
hmm
something that I learned from listening to various media about the TV show The Office is that the more
hmm
specific an idea, the more broad the appeal it tends to have. And it's sort of a fascinating, I'm not quite sure the word dichotomy comes to mind, but I don't think that's quite the right word. It's sort
yeah,
of
no, I yeah,
that the as of this recording, your most successful story in views and favorites on DeviantArt is the one that has such a specific idea.
yeah. Yeah, I've never thought about it that way. I'll admit it. I'll be open and honest. I know this is kind of a cardinal sin for some people. I have never watched The Office outside of like a few episodes here or there. So you said that idea, and I was like, I'll take your word. I have no idea what you're talking about, but I believe you on that. But yeah, that's very interesting. Why do you think that is?
I think, and it was the American version creator Greg Daniels who said it. But I think it comes down to the more specific you get with an idea, um, and especially when it comes to stories, the idea, if it's a well written story, that tends to lean into characters.
Mm,
Um,
hmm.
the more specific you get with an idea in a story, because it tends to fall into characters, people are able to relate specific instances in that story to their own life
Sure.
or experiences that they've had.
I guess that's yeah. I could kind of see that. Like the more narrow you make the field, the deeper you can dive in, kind of thing, right? And so I guess with that, you can kind of people can find a lot more complexity and depth into the characters if the characters are all that you have to work with because you're operating on such a narrow spectrum. And so the deeper the characters, the more the people can kind of pick through and find some aspect of them that they relate to. I like that. That's really cool. I've never thought about it that way, but I like that a lot.
Yeah. And I think the characters are probably the easiest to latch onto and relate to, but I think it can also apply to the experiences the characters have and the settings, the people that they run into. Every pretty much everything that happens in a story, the more specific it gets, um, for some reason, the easier it is for people to relate to it.
Yeah, yeah. It's very interesting. I like that a lot.
Yeah. Um, and even if you'd watched the show, which I I've kind of blasphemized you in my mind now that you haven't seen it, but
Yeah, yeah.
even if you had watched the show, things like that, you'd have to read books about the show or listen to podcasts and like go out of your way to really dive into external media about it that has no relation to it beyond it's about The Office. Um,
Right. Yeah.
so
Well, I will add it to my ever-growing list of things that I need to watch. And whenever I get through it, I'll definitely let you know. So,
yes, that's something I would love to talk about with anybody. But
yeah.
something that I was very curious about is when you talked with Hans on the Wedgie Talk episode you did with him. You said you want to write a story comprised entirely of dialogue, and this one, while not entirely comprised of dialogue, it does seem to capture that to some degree. Are you still looking to capitalize on that idea, or does this one sort of centralize it?
I think this one is probably my best stab I'm going to take at it realistically. Um, that idea of a dialogue dominated story is one that I've had for quite some time as well. But the more I've been thinking about it, because it's been a little bit since I talked with Hans on the Wedgie Talk episode, but the more I've thought about it and kind of toyed it over my head, the more I realized for this in fetish and this community as a whole, one of the things that strikes out to me is there is an integral necessary element for like imagery and details outside of dialogue. At least for me, that's like part of the sort of the enjoyment and the pleasure that I get from reading these stories or consuming any of the other media that people make around this topic is um, it's very easy for somebody to say what is happening, right? For somebody to just didactically sort of express that, or dialectically, I guess, express that. But the more that I've kind of gotten into writing, and especially the more I've started writing non-fetish related stuff, just more general writing, which is why I've kind of slowed down a lot in my uploads and my writings for this community and everything. So I can focus a bit more on that. Is the more that I do that, the more I come to appreciate the kind of the show don't tell aspect of it, and I really like imagery. in detail and just setting the scene and kind of explaining things in a, to some people, probably annoyingly intimate detail about what's going on. And I really enjoy that aspect of writing. And to me, at least, it's more powerful than um, what a character could say about something in certain aspects. And specifically in regards to this fetish. And so I think this story might be my best crack at it because there is so much dialogue, and the dialogue is entirely centered around, you know, the wedgie and its increasing magnitude throughout the story, and all of the imagery. In some sense, it almost feels like the dialogue is a direct sort of expansion upon the imagery that is happening. Some scene is being said, and then um, Dr. Bradshaw is talking about it in extensive detail, and then another scene is set, and she's talking about it, and another scene, and she's talking. Um, and so I don't know. This is starting to turn into a kind of a convoluted train of thought answer, but it's one of those things that I feel like the imagery can sort of set the scene, if you will, right? That's what it's there for. It's there to set the scene, and then the dialogue unpacks the scene. Um, and maybe that's something that every other writer or or literary analyst has noticed or picked up on um, for a long time. But it's something that I didn't really pick up on until the past, I don't know, year or so. So I think this is probably my best crack at it, like a full dialogue story.
Yeah. I, if Hans is listening or other people who I've gone in depth with this are listening, they will know what I'm going to get at. Um, what I'm hearing is that you've learned to lean into the indirect detail.
Oh, absolutely. Indirect characterization is infinitely more valuable in writing, and it creates a richer experience than um,
Oh.
direct details and stuff. Yeah. Oh no, absolutely. And that's something that I'm sure I learned it in school at some point in time, English teacher talking about it or whatever. But I didn't really come to appreciate it until I started writing a bunch, where I was like, man, this is so much easier. It's easier on the writer too, I think, to be completely honest with you, to indirectly allude to things. But yeah.
Absolutely. Oh man. Indirect detail. Oh, yes. Thank you so much for saying that. Oh man. I think on a small level, it's easier for the writer
Mhm.
if you use indirect detail, but I think it's way more so um if you're writing with indirect detail instead of direct detail, you
Mhm.
don't have to write every single thing that comes up and
Right.
explain it.
Mhm.
You can put the hints and clues for so much of it in there and then focus on writing the way you want to. You can
Right.
leave the characterizations and details that don't really matter at the end of the day to the story. You can leave those up to the intelligence of the readers to imply and infer.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Man, we are gonna get along famously. Oh yes.
That's good. That's good. And like I said, I have a tendency to enjoy detail, and I think that's just because I am, weirdly enough, I know a lot of people with this fetish. Maybe I'm over generalizing here, but I imagine a lot of people with this fetish would have a tendency to be a little bit more introverted or a little bit more reserved, just kind of due to the usually intimately sort of, like you alluded to earlier, private um, way that this fetish sort of embeds and expresses itself within people. I'm the exact opposite. I am extraordinarily outgoing, and I love to talk with people, and I am a big talker. I love talking, in case you haven't already picked up on that. And so when I started writing, I tried initially to write how I talked, which was a lot of details, a lot of emphasis and dramatization to help sort of paint a picture or a scene or something, like I would be telling a story out loud. which I don't think is a bad place to start. But I totally agree that as my writing has sort of evolved, it's gotten far more um, nuanced and leave it up to the reader as to all the intimate details that are going on.
Hmm.
Which is it's made my writing easier. It's made it shorter, which is easier on me for editing and uploading and things like that. And I think it appeals to people a little bit more because um, too much detail can sort of block you in. It can stop the mind from wandering elsewhere because if the story says that this person is looks like this, then and you go all the way down to every freckle or every this or every that, you kind of limit the imagination, which I think is the opposite of what writing should do, which should be to help expand the imagination. So
Yes, absolutely. And it slows the action down. This
yes,
the meat of the story that actually matters is slowed down if you have to bog it down with so much extra characterization and detail about the surroundings and settings.
absolutely, absolutely.
On the topic of detail, I
Hmm.
I think the only legitimate critique that I have for this story is in the beginning, I wish there had been a little more detail describing the setting beyond Dr. Bradshaw adjusting the pillows of her bed.
Hmm.
Even in that, you can imply a lot because the way you wrote it gives us so much to work with just a
Hmm.
very small amount. But because the details are so vague, I guess. It unless you are taking the time to imagine the rest of the surroundings, they do end up feeling kind of empty.
Sure. Yeah. Um, I totally see that. I totally, and even to some extent, agree with that. It's been a hot minute since I wrote this story. I think I published it over like a year ago, and so um, I I'd be lying if I said I could think back and remember back then as to what my exact thought process was. I may have just been excited to get right into the action, or it may have just slipped my mind. But yeah, I totally see you. I see where you're coming from on that. So
Yeah. And it's a very small thing compared to the weight of the rest of
oh
the
yeah,
story.
no, absolutely. But all criticism is welcome and valid in
Yes.
my mind. So
Yes. Yes. That's how we writers thrive and grow is through constructive
absolutely,
criticism.
absolutely.
So diving a little more deeply into the actual story, where did the idea for a scientific study on the effects of atomic wedgies come from?
So it's when you put it like that, it sounds goofy. Like in some respects, it is goofy, and I think that's where it started. It is like, you know, part of the appeal of this fetish, and especially with the more extreme elements of it, like the more extreme variations of wedgies and stuff like that. To me, at least, is the fact that they're so absurd and kind of that absurdity playing itself out in like really serious situations is just funny and appealing to me. So, like, um, plenty of stories, and there's plenty of stories like this. I'm sure I'm overcomplicating something that a lot of people probably feel and imbibe within themselves in regards to this fetish, which is like, you know, anybody could just reasonably, get a wedgie in the middle of the day. It happens not all the time, but frequently. It's no more uncommon, I think, than friends picking on each other or stuff like that. But there's something enticing about such an absurd level of this occurring at such a prestigious or outlandish place for it to occur. So, like, things like people being hung up by their underwear in public or all these outlandish scenarios. And what really gets me is not just that itself, but the person who's undergoing the wedgie being completely sort of um, ambivalent to the entire ordeal, right? They're not mortified that they're in this extreme circumstance that is probably never going to happen in real life or to any other person, within the confines of the story, but there's some other factor that's making them not worry too much about it, right? Because they're doing it for something, for some other reason, or it's happening for some. Um, I don't know if that concept makes sense. I'm not really explaining it as well as I want to, but the way that it took place with this is I was like, what's something that is perfectly suited to just be absurd and outlandish, where any normal person would read this and go, that is absurd and outlandish. Um, but somebody maybe within the confines of the story would be like, "Oh yeah, this totally makes sense." And so I thought, in the academic world, in the world of research and stuff like that, I don't know how familiar you are with this, and I'm not very familiar with it, but people will research and do tests on the stupidest things, like things that you read
Yeah.
about, and you're like, how is this ever going to be practical or useful? And so and it's fun to read about some of these tests, and you always see the headlines of like scientific research shows the most ridiculous thing you've ever heard, and you're like,
Yep.
why are we even doing stuff like that? And so that's kind of where the idea started. And so I was thinking to myself, what would be, a ridiculous iteration of that for the fetish. And I think it naturally concluded, oh well, an attractive, prestigious, successful woman willingly submitting herself to, an atomic wedgie multiple times over and just talking about it. And normal people being like, and within the, sort of reality of the story, normal people being like me, going, "Why is this ever useful?" But then all of her colleagues being like, "Oh yes, this is very important for X, Y, Z, blah 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 blah." And so that's kind of where the appeal for me came for the idea. And then like I said, oh, the setting just kind of perfectly arose for me to write it out.
Yeah. And it's maybe that's a point towards understanding realism that I don't think has been brought up before. Is having a very realistic and grounded idea to begin with
Hmm.
can help you create a very realistic and grounded story.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think I'll try and keep this point brief because I've been talking a lot. But I think I may have mentioned this when I talked with Hans last time, but I love finding ways to adapt the fetish to everyday circumstances and
Hmm.
everyday situations. And I really, really like sort of observing the world around me and finding a way to put some sort of, wedgie related spin on it for the sake of the story, because drawing from the real world, I think, makes the best stories. And so I think at the time I was probably reading some ridiculous scientific study, just for the sake of just seeing what these people had to say, and that's probably what kind of sparked the idea.
Very nice. Yeah. That's kind of the point with these episodes though, is to hear the writer speak on it. So
Yeah,
talk as long as you feel is
thanks,
necessary,
appreciate that.
especially from one such as yourself who is so verbose and erudite. Uh,
Thank you,
it's
thank
very nice. It's fantastic. You make my job as a host extremely easy.
you. Well, I'm glad I could help you out there. So,
Okay. So looking at this story versus the rest of your work, how different or similar would you say it is?
in some regards, I think it's pretty on brand for me. I try and do very um heavy character focused stories. I prefer to, excuse me, I prefer to dive into the characters within the story, because like we discussed, I think that's where a lot of the meat and potatoes in terms of relatability is going to be found. I have done some stories that are more focused on the setting or the imagery and stuff like that, but I think a lot of the stories that I've done have been character studies more than anything else. So for that, I think this is pretty on par. The formatting of it is definitely something that I've never done before. Like I said, the kind of the very heavy on the dialogue, few, if any, details, and then it being, sort of grossly expanded upon, by this person sort of just talking about their circumstances. That was a type of writing that I'd never done before, which was almost this sort of real time play by play, which is really cool. But I never really done something like that before, or at least done it so consciously. Um, and so I think that's probably the way that it was the most different, was sort of the formatting and the tone. of the entire thing. Not tone so much into like mood. Maybe tone's not the best word, but kind of the voice that the character uses, the way the character expresses what they're doing or what's
Mhm.
going on, as opposed to the way that characters in other stories had expressed what they were going through or what was going on.
Yeah. And it sounds like you grew to some degree after from writing this story. Are there any other ways that you feel like you did grow after you'd completed it?
Um, Definitely, I think the most obvious one. I think all the stories that I posted during that little 2 week trip where I wrote a bunch of them. A bunch for me, I should say. I'm sure there are people who would think that's chump change, only putting out like 3 or 4 stories in 2 weeks, but that was a lot for me. Um, I think I grew in the respect that everything that I wrote there was in that span was so different from each other. I had a couple other stories that like if you just look on my DeviantArt page, you'll see like kind of the stories. I think it's like the one right before this one and the one right after this one were also written during that time period, and they're all kind of different from each other. Like they're not related in any way, shape, or form. Um, and so I would say after this one, I really learned um, the importance of diving into the personal experience at an intimate level, right? I already knew how to dive into like intimate details and sort of the impersonal, the sort of intimate imagery of what's going on, but diving into sort of this internal conflict of interest of what's going on, right? Like as the story progresses, you get the vibe that that Dr. Bradshaw, the character, is sort of, you know, slipping from her professional kind of attitude about this entire thing to just being far more for her own enjoyment, and kind of expressing that slowly kind of that slow fall, um, as well as having a character articulate, like I said, in such intimate detail everything they're going through, really helped me just kind of set the blueprint, so to speak, for other stories about where is a good medium on detail, right? Because characters within this type of writing obviously are going to react if they're getting a wedgie, but they're not going to all react in the same way. And so exploring the full depth of it, um, from the top end where it's just a mild annoyance to somebody who has some sort of um, comfort with them. I guess comfort's kind of the bad word, but she's used to them, and so all the way down to the far end, which is somebody who's like completely and totally affected down to the deepest level by this, has kind of. I'll sometimes come back to this and be like, okay, if character X in the story I'm working on is responding to getting a wedgie, how would they talk about it? How would they think about it? How would they feel about it? And I've kind of explored the full spectrum of this story, so I can reference it, which is really cool. Which is really cool to be able to reference my own work to kind of help aid me in future projects. I like it a lot.
Definitely. So there's a lot there that I think a lot of writers can pull from to learn. What was your writing process for this story, and has it changed in the year or more since then?
Not really. No, I'm a big um block writer. Like I'll just sit down, brainstorm all the ideas kind of haphazardly over the course of a couple of weeks usually, and then I'll be like, all right, it's Saturday at 11 a.m. and I don't have anything to do until 7 tonight, so I'll sit down and I'll just write, and I'll just write, and finish it all in one sitting. That's usually how my writing style goes. Um, Occasionally I will write things in sort of in blocks. I've been doing that a little bit more recently, but that's just mostly been due to time constraints. I haven't had a big block of time to sit down and write just all the way through, but that's how I prefer to do it. And so that was the process that I used for this story. It's a process I've used for most of my stories, um, and it's my preferred way to do it.
Oh wow, that's a little inspiring to hear that you're able to capture your thoughts in such a visceral way to write for such a long period of time, even to just sit down and start writing in general. I think that is a major struggle for so many of us in the community.
Hmm.
Are there
No,
any
I.
Are there any techniques or anything that you put into place that help you get your
Oh
thoughts
yeah.
onto the paper?
The biggest one that I have, so I don't know about you, but I have to be listening to like music or have something going on in the background while I'm writing. But I also am very scatterbrained and easily lose focus. So I listen to foreign music, like music that's not in English, so that I don't understand what they're saying. I'm not paying attention to what they're saying. I can just kind of enjoy the music in the background. So I listen to like a lot of French and Spanish and Russian music, weirdly enough, just because it's something to put on music wise to kind of get me in the writing mood, but also something that I won't fixate on the lyrics or sing along or anything like that. That's the big one. The other one is I weirdly enough, I write better whenever I am hungry or like I'm on an empty stomach. I've noticed this recently. And I don't know if it's like that, the mentality of like once I'm done, I can go get food. So like it motivates me to keep writing. But like if I'm full and I've just eaten dinner and I'm like happily full, one or two glasses of wine in, I really don't want to sit down and write. I just want to, lounge around and enjoy myself. So um, and that's something that caught me off guard because I didn't notice that I did that, or that was kind of my go-to way to go about it up until about 5 or 6 months ago. Whenever I was like, man, I've had this idea and I want to write it, but I just can't figure out why I haven't written it yet. And I realized it was because every day I was coming home from work, making dinner, eating, and then just watching anime or TV or something like that until I went to bed. And so I was like, and it was like later that week whenever I got off work early and I hadn't had lunch and I got home and I was like, I'll try writing just for a little bit, and I was hungry, and I like wrote a huge thing, not even wedgie related, but I wrote like a huge thing out before I even let myself eat, and I was like, man, maybe food is like a very strong motivator for me, like I'm an animal or something. But yeah, so
Wow, that's wild. As a very quick aside, uh, I somebody's getting toted away in an ambulance right outside my window.
no,
That's so what the fuck. But
yeah,
it's a little wild to me that I've talked to multiple people about motivational tactics and how they can get in the mood. And a couple of people have mentioned that they need to have background sound going on, like a sort of white
hmm,
noise.
yeah,
And it's entirely the opposite for me. When
really,
I need complete silence. It's distracting to me because I get so, even if it's not lyrics that I can understand or there are no lyrics, I still get so invested in the music. I just start paying attention to that rather than actually writing. So
huh?
it's
Super interesting.
yeah, it's something that is so foreign to me that it's very interesting to hear.
Yeah, no, that is very interesting.
While you were writing this story, did you struggle with anything?
There were a couple points where there were some hiccups. I think I went through a couple of iterations on, excuse me, on, so like the story is like tiered, right? There's multiple scenes, and each time the wedgie is sort of progressing and is like tracking the progress as she, you know, gives herself a worse and worse one. And there were a couple of times where especially whenever we got to what was it? Trying to like consult it here. Whenever she actually like has the waistband in her mouth, which I think is like the fourth one or something like that.
Yeah.
That whole section I think is the shortest, and also it was my least favorite to write. One, trying to purposefully misspell words in a way that makes it sound like somebody has something in their mouth that is making it difficult to speak was exceptionally difficult for me. One, because I was battling autocorrect about 85% of the time, and it was constantly like, "Do
Yeah.
you mean this?" And I'm like, "Yes, I do mean that, but I'm trying not to mean this." And it completely fucked my autocorrect for months afterwards because I would misspell something that
Jeez.
like the word "this" or the word "much," and it'd be like, "Oh no, you mean this one," or I'm like, "No, I actually need you to fix it." And so there was a little bit of frustration, mostly just because you know I was multiple hours in at this point. I'm purposefully misspelling things and it's not correcting it, and I'm also trying to misspell them in a way that'll still convey what it is she's trying to say. So there's some technical challenges there, right? But secondly, I had trouble getting into the perspective of somebody who is enjoying what is happening, and then suddenly they are not enjoying what is happening. There's kind of a tone shift where she's, um, you know, enjoying the wedgie up to the certain point, and then once it progresses to this level, she no longer is, because she's like, I hate this. This sucks. Everything going on about it sucks. Um, and so while I was writing it, I think it comes across well. I hope it comes across well. But while I was writing it, I kept getting in my own head thinking, this is too much of a tone shift. This is gonna like throw the story out. I don't really know how to like, because how do I bring it back, for the grand finale part of it and everything like that. And so I probably typed out and rewrote that very short section 7 or 8 or 9 times, just because it never came out the way that I wanted it to. And I still think I may have been able to do it a little bit better, but I'm happy with how it ended up in the actual publishing. So
Yeah, and I mean I think it's a very nice addition that it's kind of funny, like it's the part you like the least in the story, but and that's sort of reflected in the rating that Dr. Bradshaw gives it.
yeah.
And I think it injects a little bit of comedy to break up the almost purely pleasure of the
hmm
story.
Yeah.
And especially, like, I laughed when even like the multiple times that I've reread it up to the most recent time, I laughed when she said "fuck me." This is much harder than I thought. Uh, Muffled by her
yeah.
underwear, but in the same tone as the rest of the recording during trial 4. I
Yeah.
just thought
Yeah.
that was one of the best. That was one of the best parts of that part of it. That comedy aspect.
Yeah. It's always fun to throw in those little things. I like it. I
Yeah.
also just realized you brought up this whole thing about it's the it was my least favorite part of the story to write, but it's also, the lowest rating that she gives out of any of it. I think that's pretty pretty good observation, that as I was writing the story, the rating that she gives for each sort of phase of what's happening is probably about how much I enjoyed writing it as well.
Yeah.
I think there's a pretty clear 1-to-1 on that, which is kind of fun.
Yeah. That's a very fascinating insight that I don't think people would have gleaned from it without talking with you.
Yeah.
What's something you're proud of with this story?
Um, I think there's a lot that I could say, and I'll try not to gas myself up too much here. But I think the thing that I'm most proud of, is I really liked the the realization that I had managed to take an idea that I had been toying with for a very long time and materialize it. It's very satisfying to read, just because I hope from an objective standpoint, it's just a good story all around. I think it's technically one of the better, um, stories that I've written in terms of, grammar and syntax and all that one good stuff. But it is satisfying to me because every time I read it, I remind myself of how long I kept this idea bottled up, and how, at some points I really wanted to express this idea in some horrifically failed writings that will never see the light of day. And so I to see it put together in a manner that a bunch of other people have enjoyed and really seem to have, connected with, is deeply satisfying to me, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
hmm
And I mean, given the fact that the dialogue is the majority of the story, I guess despite that, um, her dialogue is extremely strong. It definitely gives the impression that it's a real scientist, albeit one setting aside some of her scientific professionalism.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
it's that's one of the shining points of this story amongst the many. But yeah, it's I think you have a lot to be proud of with this story.
Thank you. I appreciate
Yeah.
that.
I think there's something extremely creative about starting off the story with Dr. Bradshaw already in the atomic. I mean, you have like Luckily Unlucky, where the story starts out with Sarah putting herself in the hanging, and there are other stories that start out with these major wedgies, but starting out with her already in the atomic. I thought that was very creative, something that I hadn't really seen much of before. If I have seen it before, it was very refreshing.
Yeah, it was a fun one for me too. I think starting off the story not in the middle of the action, but sort of jumping right into the action, I think leaves a lot of room for writers to somewhat provide a little bit of tension or like a little bit of mystery, right? You're kind of thrown right in, and you're like, all right, this is cool, but why are we here? And then there are, once you ask that question, there are a myriad of options of how to sort of open up that, why are we here question and explain it, like I did with the whole her explaining the experiment that's happening before she even talks about, her findings, so to speak. That was something that I really had fun with, and I think it helped set the mood for the entire thing. Where it's like, okay, if this is a scientific experiment, it would make sense for the scientists to say what it is they're doing before they talk about any of their findings. Um, so I had fun with that too. It was really cool.
Yeah, and starting out on such a high level, um, I think even that draws readers into they're wondering, well, if he started out here, where could he possibly go? I got to see what happens next.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
you absolutely deliver. You keep
yeah,
going higher and higher. You keep raising the bar.
yep.
One thing that I personally love is the inherent flaw in Dr. Bradshaw's methodology. Yeah, scientific experiments are supposed to be completely unbiased, yet the
Hmm.
results will be entirely biased because she's
Yeah.
deriving pleasure from the wedgies. And it's also
Hmm.
a very nice touch that you have her bring up that she did try to get other participants before herself, and so was forced into it to some degree.
Hmm.
it, Performing all the trials in one go where the effects cumulatively build up rather than spacing them out could be a flaw, but could also
Yeah.
not be depending on what she's going for with the experiment.
Right.
And that's something that's not quite laid out. So it's left up to the imagination
Yeah.
to determine the actual parameters of the full experiment, which I think is really nice as well. And then
Hmm.
I think with those two details, the objectivity of the experiment is completely thrown out the window, and it makes for a very fun story, a very interesting take on the fetish, and maybe even what could happen in the future if this fetish keeps gaining mainstream attention. People might start
Definitely.
studying it like this.
Yeah, definitely. I knew right from the get go, one of the earliest iterations of the story, like I said, that will never see the light of day, involved the main, sort of participant in the experiment enjoying the wedgie. And I thought it would be a really fun sort of irony of the fact, like you kind of pointed out, the scientific experiments are supposed to be unbiased, and right from the get go, all of hers are going to be biased out the wazoo. And I had a lot of fun sort of playing up that dichotomy of here she is, a professional who's attempting to do, her job, the scientific experiment, but she's at conflict with herself over her personal preferences, and she addresses it right from the get-go, saying, yes, I understand that I might have some personal um, preferences, but I can assure you that nothing will come of it. It will still be a strictly,
Yeah.
everything of that nature and everything. And it's like, does anyone believe you whenever you say that?
Yeah.
Anyone who knows you, like if you're no one who doesn't know Bradshaw or anything, they probably will believe you. But all of the other doctors that she references, I like to imagine they kind of know her well enough that they're like, she brings up the idea of this experiment, and they're like, one, no, we're not doing it, and two, you definitely can't do it. And she's like, well, there's nobody to do it. And they're like, well, then maybe you shouldn't do it at all. And then she just kind of is like, oh, screw it, I'll do it, and show everybody up. And they're like, okay, this is a bad idea, but you do you. And so, um, and then obviously, like you pointed to, sort of the devolution of the entire thing, where by the end, nothing that she has, none of her findings or recordings are useful by the end of it.
Yeah.
And so it's almost as if this entire thing was for nothing, which is just a level of, you know, humor to it that was really fun for me to work with. Like, really, I went through all this and I get nothing out of it. It's like, yeah, pretty much.
Yeah,
So
yeah, and I think that I think that has to have driven some of the interest in writing it in the first place. Is that
right, yeah.
that fun, that split away, taking such a boring, mundane idea of a scientific study and changing it into, well, what if the professor, the scientist, is actually very invested in the result and what will happen with that? So and that fun, that whimsy comes across very well.
Thank you. Yeah, that was one of the best parts about it. I had a lot of fun with that.
Yeah, and it's one of the best examples of indirect detail that you give with it. There are some lines of dialogue that allude pretty heavily to it, but you never explicitly state it, and it's indirect detail. Just
Yeah,
what a beautiful thing.
good stuff. It is. It's really awesome. I like it.
Yeah. Um, Something that I'm very curious about, as just someone who became very interested in the story and sort of the world surrounding it, is she mentions at one point that she can't let her excitement get in the way of her job.
Hmm.
Is her study being funded by any entity, or is this something she's pursuing with her own resources?
I always imagined it was something that was, and obviously I left it up to open ended
Hmm.
for obvious reasons, but I always imagined it in my own head that after consulting with a couple of her colleagues who were like, this is a really bad idea, and they weren't in on it, she sort of haphazardly pitches it to, the funding board, and they're very much like, where is this coming from? What are we doing with this? But she's so prestigious in my mind. Dr. Bradshaw is, at the top of her field, and she's so innovative and ingenuitive and always pushing the boundary, that even though a lot of the people who fund it, whether it's the university or private investors or whatever you want to think, um, are very much put off by it, they have faith in her. So they're kind of like, okay, let's go ahead and go forward with this tentatively, because we really don't see any value in it, but we see value in you. And if you're saying this is worth pursuing, then we're going to take your word at it. That's how I always kind of imagined it playing out in in my mind, which is part of the reason why she's so adamant about keeping her own personal preferences out of it. Because if this whole thing falls through, then she's suddenly kind of, alone on an island. Um, so
Yeah. Yeah, it's just I think it was it's one of those things that engages readers, and
mhm.
it's one of those questions that it's not that you didn't explain it properly. It's one of those things that makes the readers want more, and that's one of the cornerstones of show business. So
Absolutely,
that
absolutely, always
extremely
leave them
well.
wanting more.
Exactly. One tiny little detail that I vehemently adore and wish was more prevalent in the community is when Dr. Bradshaw says "my wedgie" when describing the effects of Trial 3, and I think a couple of times afterwards. Uh,
Hmm.
that tiny, tiny phrase, those two words of acceptance, carries with it so much of the domination, submission aspect of the fetish that so many of us have.
Hmm.
I wish it existed more in the fetish.
Yeah, I totally agree. Um, I totally agree with that. That is something. The more, um, I guess, the more BDSM elements that can be read into or incorporated with this fetish, I wasn't a massive fan of whenever I first developed the fetish like ages ago. But it's something that I've grown to appreciate in moderation. Right, it is its own
Mhm.
thing, but there's some overlap between you know the wedgie fetish and the BDSM fetish and everything. A good deal of overlap, I would say, and
Yeah,
so. Yeah, I totally agree. That's a favorite of mine as well when I
yeah,
see it expressed in other writings.
yeah. And I will say that I'm definitely very engaged in the BDSM
Well, there you
aspect
go.
of things, but so I think that's where a lot of my
Absolutely.
enjoyment comes from it. But
Sure. Yeah.
I think to some degree, um, almost every wedgie fetishist has that. If it's not a fetish, then they have it as a kink.
Yeah. No, that vein runs through. I think all of us probably.
Hmm.
Um, I agree totally.
Yeah, yeah. They're intrinsically linked.
They are. Yeah. It's something that the more I think about, the more it makes sense, and the more willing I am to sort of open myself up to that world of it. And so it's good. I like it. Still definitely not my favorite. I still definitely just prefer Wendy's
Oh,
over it, to be
absolutely.
totally frank with you. But yeah, no, that's why we're here. But
Yeah,
yeah, no, I totally. It's fun.
yeah. This whole study that Dr. Bradshaw is doing makes me very curious to see what other experiments she's run and if she's been successful in gaining participation from anyone but herself in them, if they're like this or if they are different. Do you have
Yeah.
any? Have you thought of any other experiments that she's run? Have you expanded her character beyond just this study?
Um, I briefly had some insight into like what type of doctor would run a study like this, because obviously like there's no need for like a doctor of economics or something to do something like this. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
And so I was kind of thinking, where do we go? What kind of would lend itself to this sort of incredulity actually being realized? And so I think the my own personal interpretation of it was that she was probably a professor of some sort of psychology of some type. And so it is some sort of like clinical psychologist or somebody explicitly running um, research on or sort of engaging in research and studies on the connections between what makes people tick and sort of that relationship it has to sex or pleasurable desires or things of that nature, which is a very fascinating field just completely removed from um, this fetish. I don't know about you, but I personally think it's very interesting, like why people develop kinks or fetishes or things where it's like something that can be um, completely absurd or even downright gross to some people is incredibly attractive or turn on for other people. Um, I think just the concept, the fact that that happens in nature is a very fascinating thing to me. And so I thought that would probably be the type of person we'd see in here. And I think it would even make more sense considering her personal, inclinations towards wedgies and everything, that she would pursue a career where she can, quote unquote, do her job while also kind of indulging in her own um, fetishes or anything of that nature. Um, and so that's kind of where I just took it. I didn't want to obviously dive into that because it's a very complicated door once you've opened it to try and navigate through in a concise manner. Um, so I didn't think it was necessary to directly express that. But um, so in regards to like other studies, it'd probably just be other studies that I've probably read about, just imagining her doing them, like the correlation between pain and pleasure, or the connections of the occur within someone's brain whenever they form a fetish versus somebody else who forms a different one and stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah, and it might be a little interesting to think as a little bit of a headcanon type of thing that she discovered her fetish for this or her interest in it in wedgies through a separate study, and that's what
Oh
led
yeah,
her to
that'd be
this
fun.
one.
Yeah, that was something I never thought about, but yeah, that'd be definitely a fun way to have it happen.
Yeah. Um, I mean, that's kind of the point with this podcast is to analyze and understand um, fetishists through their writing. That's
Hmm.
that's one of the things I'm looking to get out of this podcast. So yeah, I definitely do have a pretty high interest in the psychological aspect of the fetish. I think it
Me too.
becomes
Yeah,
I think
it's
it
a
becomes
very interesting one in my opinion. Amidst, and obviously, I think we're interested in this fetish because we are active members of the community.
mhm,
But it is definitely an interesting one because it feels to me like it is a sort of a potluck of a variety of other more mainstream fetishes, little bits and pieces of things taken from other places or other um, kinks that is kind of collaboratively thrown into one big pot that produces this rather bizarre at first glance sort of bizarre thing that you'd be like, how is that attractive? But then you start thinking about it and you're like, oh, I see, the aspect of an underwear kink or a bullying kink or a BDSM thing, and you can kind of trace all these little like like tributaries that flow into it. It's very very fun to think about sometimes.
definitely. And if we're looking at the fetish in that context, then I would definitely say that the wedgie fetish is greater than the sum of its parts.
Agreed, definitely agreed.
Yeah. Is there any deeper meaning that you were trying to write into the story itself?
um Not particularly. I'll be completely honest. I think this is just a good idea that I had that made its way down onto paper. I think with most things, I think authors tend to express a lot of themselves in their writings, either actively or, passively.
Definitely.
I think it's really hard for anyone who creates any form of art, not just literature, but paintings or drawings or anything of that nature. I think it's very hard for anyone to remove um, things like personal bias or preference or thing from or anything like that from it. Um, just because tapping into the creative nature of the human spirit is something that is I think one of the deepest forms of self-exploration that you could do. So it's obviously going to end up with, having pieces of yourself in it. But I think with this one, if anything is to be read deeper into it, it's probably it was a passive move on my end. I've written some stuff that has definitely been um, intended to be read deeper into, rich with symbolism and metaphors and imagery to convey feelings more than necessary images, if that makes sense. So people can have room to kind of explore on their own. This was not one of those. So,
Yeah. And yet, this is the story that we're discussing.
yep. And here we are. Here it is. Yep. The
And
irony of it all.
I mean, we have been discussing this for over an hour, so I think there is a little bit more to
Oh
it
my gosh,
than
has it already
you
been
might
an
think.
hour already?
Yeah, exactly.
Good night.
I was blown away when I saw 30 minutes had passed. Like,
God,
you
it
make
feels
it
like I've been here
so
for like
easy.
20 minutes.
Yeah.
Man, I need to learn how to talk less, or at least use less words
No.
to
No,
convey.
no, 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 no. No. Don't look into that at all. It's a beautiful thing that you're able to do this.
Fair enough. All right,
It
thank you.
gives very insightful and engaging conversation. And I personally don't believe every single work that you put out needs to have a deeper meaning. Um,
Hmm.
some things can just be for fun or sporadic.
Absolutely.
But I 100% agree with you that everything you put out can be a reflection on yourself, your desires, your wants,
Hmm.
uh, aspects of you that you might not even be aware of that you're unintentionally putting out onto the page or onto the canvas.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow, I actually avoided this the entire time, and now it's catching up to me as my propensity for having a thought and then losing it.
Yeah.
I can't focus on it because then it will go away. But so I'll come back to it if it comes back to me. But
Okay.
is there anything readers seem to be overlooking when it comes to this story?
Mm, I don't know. I one of the things I wish I did better was interact with more people in this community. I don't interact too frequently with too many people. There are a couple of people that I keep in touch with rather frequently that I've met through here. But I haven't really had a whole lot of dialogue about the sort of readers' observations about this story up until you and I started talking about it a couple of days ago before we sat down for this. Um, and I was actually a little bit caught off guard that this was the story you wanted to talk about, not because I didn't want to talk about it, obviously, as you can tell I enjoy talking about it, but I it kind of caught me off guard that you were like, oh yeah, if you wrote this story then I want to talk about that one. I was like, really? I think that one's pretty straightforward. But so I would say if there is anything that readers are missing, I'm missing it too. Because I'm pretty um I'm very critical of my own work. um I think I'm harsher on myself, and I think this is true for most artists of any form. That they're the harshest critic on themselves, right?
Definitely.
Um, and so I it brings me so much joy whenever anyone enjoys anything that I put out, not because I'm seeking validation or seeking some sort of fulfillment by people enjoying it, but because I think my sort of one of my missions ever since I started writing in this community was just to literally put out stuff that people enjoy. Because I know what I enjoy, and I think everybody understands that we don't have to write anything down to enjoy what we enjoy. There's you can imagine as as far as you want to, circumstances or stories that happen that never have to be written down. It's a lot of work to sit down and create. And so just anytime anyone derives any sort of enjoyment or pleasure in any form from any of my stuff, I I take great satisfaction in that. So if there's anything that people think they're missing, I'm sure things can be read into it. But I think people, the readers, whoever they may be, got it with this one. This was just a fun story um, about a professional woman undignifying herself for the sake of science, and that's pretty much it. So.
Yeah, but I mean, like, going back to the point that I brought up before, like, even the most innocuous things that, from the writer's perspective, might not seem much.
Hmm.
Readers can look at it from an entirely different perspective, and oftentimes they do.
Right.
And those are the perspectives that give you the full picture. Um, they
Absolutely. Absolutely. The
so
writer
so many
creates the
times.
story, but I'm sorry. I'm
Oh,
talking
you're
over
fine.
you.
You're fine.
No, do
But so many times, the readers will bring to your attention something that you weren't aware of, that you unintentionally put in
hmm
the story, or that you overlooked. And
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's happened in the hour plus that we've been talking. You brought up
yeah.
some points that I've been like, huh, I've never thought about it that way. But now that you
Hmm.
mention it, yeah, that does make sense. So I totally agree. I mean, I guess that's kind of the whole artistic experience in a nutshell, right? Is that the creator creates, but the creator can only see things from their own perspective, and so getting another person's perspective helps deepen and enrich the artistic experience because they have a whole different set of circumstances that shapes every aspect of whatever art is being consumed. So it's a really it's a very interesting thing, and I'm definitely not one of those types of people that thinks all art is equally good. I'll be completely frank with you.
I
I think
agree with
people
that.
can make. I think people can definitely make bad stories or books or paintings or drawings or sculptures. There are plenty of them out there, but I think for the most part, one of the truly amazing things about art in general is that it is a circumstance or situation that requires both ends, both parties to collaborate on to get the full experience out of. And that's not to say that the observer is as equally important as the creator. Obviously, without the creator, there's nothing to observe. But the creator, as you well know, can almost become bitter towards their work because it requires so much effort and it feels like you're not getting anything out of it. And to have that interaction with people who enjoy it, I think that's where you get the full experience of um, the depth of what has been created and enjoyed. So,
Yeah. Well, from an art perspective,
thanks,
beautifully
appreciate
said.
it.
Beautifully said.
I'll
Um,
come off my soapbox now and just step back down to
I'm
reality. So,
there's so much truth to that though. Is content creators, artists, we live in a bubble, and
hmm
we can only see things from our perspective, and so
hmm
the only way to get a fuller and richer perspective and experience from what we've put out is to engage with the audience that is consuming it.
yeah, yeah, definitely.
I did remember the thing that I was going to bring up earlier. Um,
All right, let's go. Good stuff.
One thing that I've been preaching for years, and that I found that a lot of people do agree with me on this, is to put out the content you want, and you'll gain the
hmm
audience that you want. If you write for
hmm
yourself, you'll find the people that are in line with your desires and what you want to express. It's a truly wonderful thing, especially in this community we- with so much dissonance and
hmm
separation, fragmentation in general, but of what people want, their desires, where people can be very split on. I want this kind of wedgie, and then someone
hmm
else says, I want this kind of wedgie. I want indirect detail. I want direct detail. I
hmm
want this thing. I want this thing. And there are so many different people that can deliver what you want, but
hmm
each person delivers something very specific and directed,
Excuse me.
that you can't get from somebody else.
Definitely, yeah. It feels almost kind of tribalistic at some point. Like you have different
Ooh,
camps of
hoo,
people
hoo.
who want one thing and one thing only. And I think one of the greatest strengths and one of the greatest weaknesses of this fetish in this community is it is so applicable, right? I mean, you have people that write
Yes.
nothing but true stories or experiences. You have people who write fiction. You have people who write about you know um, like imaginary characters from cartoons or animes or anything like that.
Hmm.
You know, in it can sometimes feel like there's camps being set up and people kind of flocking to one camp or the other and being like, well, this is the best way to do it, and that other way is wrong, and everything like that. And that was always one of the things that, I'll be honest, kept me from coming into the community for so long. Was I had seen so much harshness and just unnecessary meanness and weirdness from people who get so adamant about things happening one way and not another, and that's not unique to this community. It happens everywhere, but it always was so ironic to me that this community, which kind of as a whole, kind of like the macro level, prided itself almost on being a tight knit community of people because the fetish is so unique and so small, though it has gotten definitely bigger since I joined it. But I remember it, especially in the early internet days, it was so small, of people
Yes.
um, who either were in it, and even smaller still of the people who were vocal and active within it. And it always struck me as so interesting that a community that kind of identified itself as being so small had such a deep rooted tradition of breaking itself even further into these different groups and everything, where it's like, if anything, this is such a small community, we should, to quote High School Musical, all be in this together, like I don't think we really need to be drawing arbitrary lines in the sand, over um, your preferences of underwear choice or wedge type or whatever, but I
What
was
a
I,
wonderful example.
thanks, appreciate it, appreciate that. um, so
Yeah.
But yeah, I totally agree. That was one of those things that always struck me as odd, and I like to think I've largely avoided. And maybe that's part of the reason why I haven't interacted with more people more frequently on here.
Mhm.
Is just subconsciously I'm trying to avoid that because I frankly I don't think anybody, but I'm too busy to get involved in that stuff. I have too
Yeah.
much stuff going on outside of this place to worry about getting into arguments with people over preferences of
Mhm.
this type of stuff. So
Wow. Yeah, and there's two things there. Is I mean, I've never heard anybody describe it as tribalistic. I think that's just a wonderful and very applicable description of the community. And the mindset that you just described that you have is so different from basically everybody that I've talked to, um, except one person. I think um,
it's good. You need to
that's
hook us up. I want to talk to that person now.
that's
Just
I think that's fantastic. That is
yeah.
amazing that there is that I'm able to talk with somebody who has such a differing opinion from so many other people that I've talked to.
Hmm.
It's not it's fantastic to have a different perspective.
Absolutely, it's a gift, and we're all drawn together within this community. Excuse me, I have been really burpy. I'm so sorry.
That's fine.
I have been, I we're all drawn together by a common interest, right?
Mhm.
The wedgies and the fetish and everything. But I think that's really, if anything, that should be sort of the nucleus that has drawn us together. I don't think it necessarily needs to be the entire construction of the relationships that we build within the community. I think
Yes.
that is a great place to start, and then I think from there we should openly, discuss and embrace the differences that we have with every other person within the community because um, there are people who come up with ideas or have perspectives that you could never imagine,
Mhm.
and it deepens and enriches the community, and it's sort of this, which in turn draws more people to it more deeply. And there's this almost paradox that occurs, which is the more we sort of embrace our differences, um, within the specific individuals of the community, the more unified the community becomes because you're seeing more and more and more perspectives all centered around this one thing that we're all here for. And so you have a deeper understanding at the individual level, right? As you build these connections one on one with people, but then you also have a deeper understanding at the communal level because there's all these new viewpoints that are floating around and being expressed. And so there's almost this paradox that the more we embrace our differences, the more unified we become, right? Um, which I think is not unique to this community. I'll be completely honest with you because I see that in so many other things. But it's one of those things that I wish other people saw, and maybe it's a point that I have realized and have been fortunate to realize, and maybe it's a lot harder to see to some other people, and so maybe I could get out there and evangelize that position for some people. But yeah, that's something that has always kind of bothered me, and why I've been so trepidatious and cautious with engaging with people within this community is because I firmly believe that, in regards to specifically this fetish, every and keeping the conversation topical, I firmly believe that the more people are allowed to express themselves, with obvious sort of natural limitations, not everything should fly, but pretty much anything, I think, that the more people are allowed to kind of sort of explore those options and freely express them and be accepted for them, the
Mhm.
the tighter we will grow as a community. So
Beautiful. Just wonderfully said. Um, and I hope that the fact that you're coming on my podcast is showing a little bit of a growth in you that you're stepping out and
absolutely,
speaking
yeah, no,
and
definitely.
you're engaging on a platform that can reach some more people.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's awesome. I told myself years ago when I started writing that I was never gonna interact with too many people in the community and everything like that, and here I am multiple years later on your podcast, on Han's podcast, and
Hmm.
having made some awesome friends through the community that most of the time I don't even talk about wedgie related stuff with them because they're just cool people. And that was just
Yeah,
what brought us together, but that's not what keeps us together.
exactly.
And so yeah, it's
Yeah,
been awesome. I've
yeah,
been um, I am happy to admit that I was wrong about this community at large, which is cool. Which is cool.
yeah, definitely. And I think the point you bring up about wedgies bringing us together, but we can expand it so much more. I think that is that's a very major reason why I like to analyze stories like this,
Hmm.
and break them down to such a degree, and just have conversations with writers, because it allows for so much more conversation beyond just the wedgies.
Right.
You can gain an understanding and delve into the mindset of other people, because really that I think is what matters at the end of the day. We're here for the wedgies, yeah, but what really matters at the end of the day is the people.
Oh yeah,
We are all
definitely agree.
looking for connection, and we found a very base level one with, yeah, we're all into wedgies. And now that we've grouped together, we found this community. We're looking for more of a connection on with people that understand such an intimate and personal detail of our lives.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it becomes way easier to talk to people about other things that aren't as intimate and embarrassing once you've talked about your deepest darkest fetish. It's like, okay, that's out of the way, let's talk about the normal stuff now, and that's super easy. So
Yeah.
it's it's cool.
Yeah, this is definitely something. This is definitely the thing that I consider my deepest secret. Um, so
I
it
would say
makes
so
it
for
so
me
much
too.
easier.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
makes it so much easier to connect with people.
It's either that or my unapologetic stance that strawberry milk is better than chocolate milk. But
I
that's a
agree.
controversy. Oh my god,
I
no way.
agree.
That is perfect, dude. I have gotten so much flack for that one. Everybody's like, it's like, yeah, on the day to day, I'll drink chocolate milk more than strawberry milk, but a
Ah,
good glass of strawberry milk is impossible to beat, in my opinion. So,
and desserts can get old so fast, but
yes,
fruits are, as I've heard it called before, nature's dessert, and they stay
absolutely.
fresh. Oh wow. Yeah, that's a small thing, but yeah, that's something I
Yeah,
definitely agree with you on.
yeah, definitely.
It actually does remind me of, as a small side note, the one there was two times that I was known throughout school as doing weird shit.
Hmm.
But the one time I did bring I bought enough Dr. Peppers to fill up a gallon, and I drank that throughout the day, and then I did the same thing with strawberry milk, and that was fun.
Oh my gosh, that's
It was
amazing.
horrible by the end, but it was fun.
I was gonna say, I bet that was the worst bathroom experience your entire life. Man, that's awesome though.
It was really just it tasted like shit at the end.
Oh, okay, fair
That was,
enough.
yeah.
Fair enough.
Um, well, I kind of hate to bring it back around to the story after such a wonderful conversation about the fetish as a whole, but did anything surprise you while you were writing Waistband Variance?
um, Not really. I think the way that it goes at the end, the kind of more extreme, sort of erotic ending that it has to it, though it's tame compared to some things I've written, I think, caught me a little bit by surprise. I purposefully don't. Um, Write a hard and fast ending to any of my stories. I think, and that's a good thing and a bad thing. I think there's pros and cons to it. I think the big pro is that as the as someone, I can't remember who, I want to say it was General Patton, but don't quote me on this, said famously said, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. I think this is writing is in a very similar state, or any art's in a similar state, where you can plan and plan and plan and have all these great ideas, but as soon as the paper, the pen hits the paper, or you hit the keyboard, or you start drawing, you get into the sort of the natural flow of it, and the plan has to change, the plan has to shift, because if you don't, you feel like you can almost choke out the story too much by hardlining it. And so I think I leave the ending open, so that the story kind of has like a almost like a reverse funnel type attitude towards it. As the more I get into it, the more natural it feels to me to take the story in any direction because I haven't committed to anything by the end, which is awesome. But then the downside is sometimes you can get lost in that sea of possibilities of what could potentially happen, and so you can get sort of um, go wayward and never really bring it back around. So the ending for the story, I didn't know how it was going to end, but it had sort of been building into this more um, erotic ending, and so I just decided to run with it. And that was something that I hadn't expected to do. I like at the outset, I was like, I'm not going to make this explicitly sexual. It's just going to be a lot of alluding to the pleasure of it, and so much not so much focusing on the pleasure of it. Um, but by the end, it's obviously focused on, and so it's that was one of the things that I wasn't anticipating, but I'm still happy with how it ended.
Yeah, absolutely. Here's a little bit of an abstract question. Um, so, the title of this story, Waistband Variance During Atomic Wedgies, a Study, is
Hmm.
extremely specific, and it does essentially say what the it essentially tells you what the story is about and what's going to happen. Um,
Hmm.
whereas other titles are very amorphous and abstract, um,
Hmm.
and perhaps try to capture a concept or an idea that the writer wants to convey. What
Hmm.
role do you feel titles should play in stories?
Yeah, I think the title of any work is just as important as the work, right? Because before anyone sees what you've written, they're seeing what you're offering them to read, right? That's the whole point of the title is you're sort of pitching your work to them. And so I think titles are always tricky for me because I want something that's going to grab the attention of any potential reader, especially in a community like this where things move so fast. Something may only be um, on the front pages, so to speak. I know that's not really how it works, but something may only really be on the front pages and be open and available to everybody for a few hours before a sea of other stuff comes in and kind of buries it underneath. And so you kind of need a title that is um, catchy, that will catch someone's attention and grab their interest, but also at the same time, you don't want to feel like you're tricking anyone by having a title that has nothing to do with the story. And so you have to make it topical. Um, and I'll admit that's something I struggle with a fair amount. Titling stuff has never been my strong suit. Um, and but this one was very easy for me to do because I was like, I'm kind of going for this more analytical tone, right? I'm going for something that is scientific and just very straight laced and very, straight edge. And so I was gonna, I think later, pretty early on in the story, she gives like the total, like the full title for the experiment. But that was too long for DeviantArt. So I had to find a way to kind of scrunch it down. But yeah, the, uh, that's probably where I look for like the role that titles plays. It needs to be um, catchy and concise and topical. Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
and you definitely fall into the same camp as Hans and Shadow.
yeah,
They've expressed before that they have trouble with titles.
yeah,
That's that seems to be a pretty common thing amongst writers in the community.
yeah, yeah.
I wonder how much that speaks to people's understanding of titles as it should capture the essence and should epitomize in a way the story,
Hmm.
and so there might be a little fear or unwillingness to put down in a couple of words what this story is.
Right.
Hmm. Might be
Yeah, I
something to
agree. I
explore.
think. Yeah. Sorry, I was. I don't know what it is. I think I may have caught something at my new job. I'm feeling a little bit sick, so if I'm coughing or sneezing or burping and all sorts of stuff, that's probably where that's coming from. So I apologize. But
You're fine.
I think, yeah, I think. it can be daunting, especially when you've written something that maybe is a little bit more um, intense in magnitude, to try and sort of scrunch that down into a few words and
Mhm.
still have it be appealing. um, I'm always a big fan of title drops, like in stories, like the title of the work appears in the story. I always think that's kind of as like a dialogue, or a point of big contention, like a big that's the title of the show kind of thing. And so but that's kind of hard to do sometimes, and often I feel it requires forward planning, like you have to plan to do that. um but yeah, I totally agree. It can be challenging to really find a way to um neatly wrap everything up and put a bow on it, which is kind of what the title is. If
Mhm.
the story is the gift, the title is sort of the wrapping paper around it. And for anyone who's tried to uh, you know do presents for Christmas or any other holiday or anything, for me at least, the wrapping paper is harder to get looking nice and pretty than the gift itself. So it's yeah, it's an interesting thing, but for the most part, I think I do a decent job about it. I think most people do, but it may just be one of those things you just kind of have to suck it up and do it. And
Yeah.
in an ideal world, we could just leave everything as untitled, please read. But that doesn't really attract people.
Yeah.
So
And I that would not be my ideal world because like when I read through the stories, if they're well written and there's something to be gained from it, um, it seems to be that after you finished with the story, the title holds more significance because you understand what the title is trying to convey to you.
I can see that. I definitely can see that. I've
Okay.
never thought about it that way, but I totally see where you're coming from on that. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I the thing that comes to mind is Lucy and Daniela, first of all,
Right.
amongst so
Right.
many other
Exactly.
stories. But my
Yeah.
favorite story comes to mind
No,
is
and I can definitely see how especially for something so as um I guess like iconic within the community. I feel like everyone's read that story, and even if you haven't read it, you've heard enough about it to know what it is. But that is um, probably as close to a great work that we're ever going to get in this community, just because it's so well done and so well um, sort of attested to by so much testimony. But regardless, um, a good title there invokes all the imagery. A good title, you
hmm
just have to say Lucy and Daniela, and suddenly everybody remembers that story, and they remember
yeah.
all the great things associated with that story, and all the drama, and all um, the build up, and the beautiful. It's been a hot minute since I've read it, but I just remember um, the how one of the latter scenes in the story is like a polar opposite flip, like a mirror of like one of the first scenes that ever happens, right? I can never
Yep.
remember how it goes, but one of them, person A is giving person B a wedgie, and then later on person B is giving person A a wedgie in like the exact same scenario, but it's flipped. And that was such a cool thing at the time. I was like, God, amazing. And I hadn't written my first story ever by the time I read that, and I was just like, dude, this guy's amazing. This is so cool. um, and
Well,
so uh,
I guess going to your point about the title brings up so much of the story itself when you hear it. You describing just that section, that the most basic way you can describe it. I know exactly the part that you're talking about, and I can tell you
Right.
exactly
Yeah.
what happens. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good one.
yeah. So there you go, Hans. There's your shout out.
Yeah. There's a shout out. Yeah.
The almost obligatory at this point plug for
You got your
Lucy and
plug.
Daniela.
There's that one's free of charge.
Yeah.
So.
Well, yeah, that's some there's a couple of through lines for this podcast, and bringing up Lucy and Daniela is one of those.
Hey, it's a good one. It's a good
Yes,
one.
yeah, I personally believe it's the best one to ever come out of the community. But you
I
can listen
agree.
to all of that on the 2 episodes I did on it. Um, what do you feel sets this story and your work apart from others in the community?
um. Well, I'm of the opinion that, like I've mentioned a couple of times, that everybody um, kind of writes themselves into um, their work, or puts themselves into their work, I guess. And I think what sets I don't think there's anything that necessarily sets this story apart from my other stuff. Personally, I don't think it does. Aside from the fact that just it's gotten a lot of traffic, and it's made a decent sized splash for a couple of people in the community, which is super cool to see. Um, but my I think what really kind of sets me apart um, within this community. Again, I'm trying to be humble here, and I don't want to. So please don't let me just start absolutely gassing myself. But I think
Please do.
I have a talent for um, for variety. Really, I've explored a multitude of settings and scenarios, and um, of all ranges, from real life to animated characters to imaginary characters, from like a D&D campaign. Like I wrote a story that's set in a world I created for D&D, which, like, you want to talk about niche, like no one that I play D&D with knows that I do this. And so I'm referencing things that literally I'm the only person that knows about any of this stuff, and the only one who cares. But I thought that was super fun. And then, like, all the way down to POV stories, and obviously like this kind of story, which is very heavily focused on the dialogue. I like to take the fetish across multiple genres almost. Um, and maybe not genre; it's all fiction, so that's probably not the good word. But different styles and different places for it to go. Historical stuff that I've done, writing in Victorian London or ancient Rome and stuff like that. I think that's probably, if I had to say, it was like my trademark stamp. Like, if you just read a story and you could say, "Oh, this is a story that this guy has written," it'd probably be that it's either in a very mundane or very obscure setting.
Very nice. Yeah, I think it's very important to look at yourself, um, and criticize yourself at times. But I think it's also extremely important to look at yourself in a positive light and talk about yourself positively.
I agree. I typically don't tend to like doing that. And it's not, don't get me wrong. I typically tend to prefer to try and stay as humble as possible,
Of
because
course.
yeah, for obvious reasons. So, but thank you for at least providing me a reasonable opportunity to do that, so I didn't have to feel like I was contriving it.
Yeah, it's important. Um,
Mhm.
and so to bring it around to my one and only segment on the show,
Okay.
I call it the Which Earth segment. And so when discussing realism in stories, I have a question I like to pose.
Okay.
Out of the four Earths I'm about to describe, which do you believe this story falls under?
My
Realistic
story.
Earth? Yes, your story.
Okay. 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 Yeah. Yeah.
Realistic Earth, where Earth is normal as we live it every day. Alternate Earth, where Earth is changed to some degree, mainly focusing on wedgies. Idealistic Earth, where Earth is changed to fit the desires of the wedgie community or some aspect of it, depending on the writer. Or fantastical Earth, where Earth is changed to be unrecognizable, like Lord of the Rings and Dungeons and Dragons. And it
Yeah.
can
Okay.
also be a mix of those four, change between them, or be none at all and be something entirely different.
I think, and you're gonna have to hear me out on this answer, because I think the first initial reaction would be it's probably the idealistic Earth, because obviously there's a high-ranking doctor professor who is doing this experiment and posting the findings publicly and everything of that nature. I have always read it myself as being set in the realistic Earth, and we talked about it briefly. Kind of a lot of the spark of inspiration for the story came from the attraction of the absurdity of the entire thing, and maybe some jaded bias I have against the absurdity of just the scientific field in general. Nothing against science, but how we were talking about how crazy
Yeah.
and ridiculous these experiments can get, and you're thinking to yourself, okay, if you're a scientist attempting to, better society, how does this better society? Because I don't need to know X, Y, and Z in the day-to-day life. And so, for example, and so I think this would probably fall under the realistic Earth for me, because I always like to imagine, 4 or 5 months down the line, pretty well into the experiment, the results start showing up, and everybody's picking up their newspapers and reading it and going, "What the fuck are they doing over there?" um, and then, the people like me and you and the members of this community are reading this and going, "Hey, yo, what the fuck are they doing over there? Like, we got to figure out what's going on." So that's where I always like this to fall into play. And I always like most of my stories in my own head canon kind of fall into the realistic Earth, where it is an absurd situation. Um, that is why the story is even happening in the first place, right? We don't write stories about, for example, an everyday night shift for a guard at a museum. But I wrote a story about it because a wedgie was involved, and so the absurdity sort of necessitates attention, if you will. In a world where wedgies were abundant in sort of everything sort of operated around them, there would be no need for such a study like this, right? Um, or in a world that's been specifically catered to us, there would be almost no need for something like this. It's only in the world where this would be so extraordinary and so out of the norm that it's worth paying attention to, in my mind. Right.
Definitely. And so you would uh, at first it sounded like you were leaning towards idealistic, but are you quantifying it as realistic?
Yes. Sorry. I
Okay.
should. I, I talked so much. I never gave an answer. Yes, realistic. Where
Okay.
I'm probably going with this one.
Okay. And I absolutely agree. Given what we have with the story, all we don't know what happens with the findings after they're sent out. All we have is the single character exploring it in the study and then at the end sending it off to a colleague. Um,
Hmm.
and it's this as far as I can remember, this is probably the only story I've ever actually quantified as realistic Earth,
Oh wow,
because of what I
that's
just said.
cool.
It's the single character exploring something that actually turns her on, which, as we've found, and as people find in daily life in their sexual encounters, as I have found, um, there are women who are into wedgies,
Yep,
um, and so
they do exist,
that's
people, no
yeah,
matter what you're told.
and so that's not that is realistic to happen.
Hmm.
And then the way you write it makes it feel extremely realistic that this could actually happen
Yeah.
on the earth that we live on.
Yeah, that's well. I'm glad it comes across that way because that's how I wanted it to. So
Definitely.
that's good to hear.
Yes. Yes. It definitely does.
Good stuff. Good stuff.
So that's all my notes, all my points that I want to hit on. Is there anything else you'd like to discuss or expand upon?
Um, Not at the moment. I don't think. I think um, anything else that I might have to say, any commentary that's at least remotely, related to what we're talking about here, I think I've probably given. You can ask me questions about anything, and I can find a way to talk about it for far too long. But I think, in regards to this, I said what I kind of wanted to say every time you asked the questions. Thank you for those. Those were really really good, and you obviously have done your homework, and it shows. And so, thank you for challenging me. I was kind of, not to belittle or anything, but whenever you asked me to come on, I'd never listened to too many of your episodes. I think I listened to one or two every now and then and stuff like that. And I was kind of like, who knows what's going to happen? Maybe this is going to be a questionnaire, a Q&A, but like you really opened it up for some amazing dialogue that I have not had the opportunity to have with too many other people in this community. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you for that. That's what I was trying to do.
Oh yeah, you crushed it, man. You're a
Thank you.
great host.
Thank
So you should do a podcast. Do you do a podcast? Because if you don't do a podcast, you definitely
you.
should.
Do you have anything you'd like to promote?
um. Ooh. Well, there. I guess this would be a good place as any to announce that I might be opening up. myself for commissions here pretty soon. That's a new thing I've never done.
Very
Is
exciting.
for as much as I've drilled into myself that I'm going to be an author who writes what I want to write and not dismiss, but not necessarily worry about what other people want me to write. I am actually considering opening up very limited amount of commissions at a time. Um, I'm actually working on one right now for somebody within the community, a good friend of mine that I talked the idea over with, and he was willing to be the test subject for. So um, be on the lookout for that. But aside from that, no. I'm not dead. I'm here. I know I don't post as frequently as I have in years past, but um, there's been a lot of change going on in my life recently, so that has sort of demanded necessary my attention. Um, but yeah, I'm here even if in a mitigated role, and I have some cool ideas out on the way. Nothing I want to spoil too much, but I have some fun stuff that I think um, people will enjoy coming out here probably in the next couple of months. So
So some very small teases keep people
absolutely.
to keep people wondering. And I have a pretty strong idea of who that commissioner is,
Do you want to take a stab here on the
but
live, or we get it
uh,
privately? I'm
Hans Gutherson.
no,
Oh
not him
shit.
actually.
Okay.
Yeah, no.
Okay.
Though I'm
All right.
sure he probably has about a billion ideas floating around in that gigantic brain of his
I'm
of things
sure
that
as
he thinks
soon as
are
he
really
hears that
cool.
you are opening
Um,
commissions, he'll message you like, "Let me do this."
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So
Well, yeah, that is very exciting. So, first of all, read this story. Second of all, read the rest of what Enigmatic has to put out, um, and then definitely commission work from him because the quality of writing is impeccable. You'll
thank you.
get
Appreciate
exactly what you're looking for and so much
that. Absolutely. Well, I shouldn't say that. I appreciate it. Thank you.
more. There's nothing
Definitely check out
wrong
this
with
guy's
knowing
stuff
your
too.
strengths.
Yeah. Definitely people should check out your stuff too. I'm relatively new to the community, to be completely frank. In terms of being active, I think I've mentioned that before. I've only been active for like 3 or 4 years, maybe coming up on 3 years. um, but already, you're one of the leaders I think a lot of people look up to in this community, so people definitely need to check out your stuff too. You got some good shit out there, so
Well, I appreciate that. It's a little surprising to hear, but yeah. So,
yeah.
as a very small plug, I did very recently finish my first very long running story after
Let's
six and a
go.
half
Let's
years.
go.
So,
Four and a
yeah, I
half
got
years. Good
6.5
night.
actually. But
Oh my god. That's
yep,
even. Oh,
yep.
dude, 6.5 years ago, I wasn't even writing. Ah,
Yeah,
that's crazy.
yeah. Took me long enough. Took long enough
Yeah. Well.
breaks, but
Hey.
yeah, I got more stuff in the works. I'll keep teasing it in every episode until I finally put it out. But I have something very
That's awesome.
special in the works for this podcast.
Super, super awesome.
I have plenty of
Well,
ideas for writing, so keep an eye out for that. But yeah,
all right. Well, thanks for having me on. I really
absolutely,
appreciate it. This was
absolutely.
a fun surprise whenever I got your message, and it's been awesome. It's been super
Yeah,
cool.
yeah, yeah. It's been absolutely wonderful discussion with you. The first of many, I hope. Thank you
Oh
so
yes,
much for
definitely.
coming on.
Absolutely. Thanks for hosting.
Yeah, and I'll definitely try and get you on some more.
All right, sounds good.
If there are any topics, stories, ideas, etc., that you'd like to hear me discuss, or if you'd like to come on for an episode, as Enigmatic has, leave a comment or send me a message on DeviantArt or Lucky Fetish as New Fedora. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you on the next episode of the Best